Our reading for this evening is indeed about the Roman Centurion from Mark chapter 15. When it was noon and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." Word of God, word of life. I was just doing my job that day. Believe me, I would much rather have been on the battlefront somewhere, carrying out my command and defending the empire. You know, I'm one of those soldiers that loves the smell of war. I love the fervor of battle. But then I was relegated to the equivalent of police duty. It was not my idea of heroic service to Rome. My boring duty was to oversee the execution of literally hundreds of crucifixions. Crucifixion was a brutal business. It was so awful that if you were a Roman citizen, you could not be sentenced ever to die by crucifixion, even if you had committed the most horrible of crimes. When I first got involved with crucifixion, it turned my stomach. It was hard to watch as someone was nailed to the cross. The nails tearing through their flesh was bad enough, but then to hang there, sometimes for days, in the hot sun, birds of prey landing on the victims and slowly pecking away at their flesh while they were still alive. And finally, if they did not bleed to death, they suffocated to death, struggling for every last breath as the weight of their body slowly pulled on their shoulders till finally they popped out of their sockets. The body was exhausted, overwhelmed with pain. I sometimes saw victims push their bodies up with their legs, trying to relieve the pressure on their lungs and get another breath of air, only to see the nails in their feet tear even bigger holes in their flesh. Many were slaves. Others were foreigners. None were citizens. They were expendable, no longer useful to the empire. Many were dangerous, threats to the state and to social tranquility. So, for the sake of the empire, for the sake of life, they needed to be like roaches, exterminated. After a while, I must admit, I became rather calloused and indifferent. You learn how to cope with such brutality. You learn how to compartmentalize your humanity. You rationalize and explain away any pangs of conscience that might haunt you. You just go along to get along. You learn very quickly in the military that if you don't conform, if you don't follow your orders, then you had better be looking over your shoulder. For soon they may come for you, and you may be the one hanging on the cross. Most of them did not go down easily. They protest their innocence endlessly and complain all the way, often spitting anger and hatred from their lips, threatening, even in their dying moments, to get back at those who have done them in. And that is what made that day, I think it was a Friday, so strange, so weird, so unnerving, even scary, and for sure, unforgettable. I remember him. His name was Jesus. Jesus. Oh my gosh, I must have crucified hundreds of Jesuses. It was not an unusual name. But this Jesus, he was from Nazareth, that small town up in Galilee. No place, literally in the middle of nowhere. That he came from there and was like this, made him so different. He hardly seemed like much of a threat to the religious authorities, but they were unnerved by him. They had just arrested him the night before and ran him through some phony trial in order to convict him of some religious crime. I think they called it blasphemy. I never heard of that before. I didn't know what it was. But whatever it was, it sure shook up Caiaphas and Annas and their cronies on the Jewish Sanhedrin. I don't know why they were in such a hurry, but they dragged him before Pilate, and in a matter of hours demanded that he take action. The whole thing to me smelled to high heaven. It was a railroad job if I'd ever seen one. Pilate typically caved in. I knew he had little background, but he really had no choice. It was his job to keep law and order. He could not afford another Jewish riot. What then would happen to his career if he couldn't manage a mob like the Jews? So Pilate turned him over to me, a centurion. I thought it was just going to be routine. The circumstances were a little suspicious, yes. But who was I to question my orders? I had a family to feed. I had a pension to protect. You guys know about all that, don't you? But from the very beginning, from the very moment I saw him, I knew that something was not right. Something odd was going on here. As we led him outside of the city to the place of crucifixion, we thought we could control him by making him carry his own cross. But you know, it was Passover time, and there were crowds everywhere. And some of them, they spat at him and ridiculed him. And others, especially women, often cried and grieved for him. That thing I could never figure out. Why they sympathized with such a troublemaker. But unlike others, all those we crucified, Jesus never resisted. He never complained. He never protested his innocence. Outside of a single time, he asked for a drink. He didn't even seem to be concerned with his pain. Instead, as he hung there, he only was concerned for others. I was stunned when he actually forgave those who were crucifying him as enemies, who had engineered this whole fiasco and delighted in his suffering. And he forgave them. Unconcerned with his plight, he even focused on his mother and her fate. So concerned was he for her as he handed him over to the care of one of his disciples. Perhaps the most unnerving of it all was when the unnatural darkness fell on the city. Now, this is not like the cloudy darkness you might see before a rain shower. No, this darkness was so thick that the sun seemed to disappear. It was as if the heavens and the gods were distressed, upset with what was happening to this Jesus. It was as if Jesus was indeed no mere mortal. The very universe, the very cosmos, the hills, the mountains, the valleys, the skies, in this darkness seemed to be in pain. Could it be? Could it be that Jesus said, or that Jesus was whom he said he was? And then, he began to pray as if he had a special relationship to his God. Now, some of the Hebrews around me said he was calling out to one of their prophets, Elijah. Others said he was quoting their scriptures. Still others said he was crying out to God in anguish. Oh, this was all becoming so confusing. Why couldn't he just die like everyone else? But then, when he finally breathed his last, his death was even different. He seemed to embrace his death. He didn't fight it. He welcomed it as if this was his destiny. As if this was his purpose. As if this dying was a victory of some sort. And then I realized it. was like a light went on, as if I had a revelation, as if I had received an epiphany. Truly, this man was unique, utterly unique. In some way, he was divine. In him, these gods or God must be doing something special. And then I saw that death was not something to be feared. I saw that the author of this world, whoever and whatever it is, the one who is in control, is not to be feared. Jesus didn't fear it. Maybe that's what the Jews are always talking about. Their God who is gracious and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. How ironic. I thought this was the end of everything. But Pilate comes to me and assigned me to supervise Jesus' burial and then to have to stand guard over his grave. Evidently, there were rumors that Jesus' disciples were planning to rob the grave and claim that Jesus had risen from the dead so that they could perpetuate their movement. I thought it was frankly ridiculous and don't know why Pilate fell for it. But early in the morning, on that third day after his death, the impossible happened. There was an earthquake, a loud noise, blinding light. I couldn't believe it. The sealed tomb was broken open. The stone was rolled back. And no Jesus. And it was no dream, believe me. This was no illusion. This was no fantasy. I couldn't believe it. But it must be the beginning of a new world. Life after that could no longer remain the same for me and for you. Then I knew that that moment he died on the cross was not the triumph of death. It was not the victory of Rome and the glory of all the powers of this world. No. It was the triumph of love, of life, of this Jesus. God's mercy for us, even in our darkest and most forsaken moments. You know, it was not a terrible Friday. It wasn't a bad Friday. It wasn't even just a Black Friday. You know, I think it was a Good Friday. The best Friday